Hi! Welcome to part 2 of my episode about music in the Aughts, part of a continuing series about American popular music in the 20th century. In the first part, we talked about sheet music and recordings, and in this episode, we'll talk about music on the stage and the rise of ragtime. I've never really done a trigger warning on this show before, but I think it might be appropriate for this one, because we will be talking about blackface minstrelsy. I've tried to deal with the topic as thoughtfully and respectfully as I can, but if it's something that you just don't want to hear about at all, this might not be the episode for you. So hopefully I'll see you next week. For anyone else, let's get to it. I'm Peter, and this is We Need to Talk About Music. When we left off at the end of part 1, I had just mentioned one of the biggest stars of popular music in the early 20th century, George M. Cohan. Cohan was a guy who had been born into the theater and spent basically his entire childhood on the road and on stage with his family group, the Four Cohens. When he grew up, he became a star on Broadway, just as Broadway was really becoming a thing, and he had a lot to do with turning it into the spectacular behemoth that it's been ever since. He was a kind of theatrical auteur who often wrote, produced, directed, and starred in his own musicals, beginning with Little Johnny Jones in 1904. They were incredibly successful, and in his heyday he was known as the man who owns Broadway. Still today, he's the only performer to be honored with a statue in Times Square. And he's also notable among songwriters from this era, in that quite a few of his hit songs, like Yankee Doodle Boy, You're a Grand Old Flag, and Give My Regards to Broadway, are still recognizable today. Cohan's shows were sort of a new kind of story-based, play-like musical, the sort that we're pretty familiar with today, but that was the exception, not the rule in the aughts. This was still the era of the variety show. American variety entertainment in the early 20th century went by a lot of names. There was vaudeville and burlesque, and there were music halls, medicine shows, oleos, and revues, among other things. All of these had some particular qualities that made them unique, but really the biggest distinction between them was venue, because this ranged from the lowliest traveling tent show to the most elite and luxurious theatrical entertainment. What it all had in common was a mixed bag of loosely to completely unrelated performances, featuring the kind of singers, dancers, actors, and comedians you would expect, as well as all manner of other acts, including trained animals, acrobats and contortionists, magicians, drag performers, visual artists, and sometimes just former athletes who apparently just kind of stood there and didn't really do anything. Altogether, this was the most popular form of professional entertainment in the early 20th century. It also gives us a chance to talk about some of the more unfortunate sides of American music history, because really the main source for all of this stuff, at least in an American context, and one could argue one of the main sources for all mainstream American entertainment, is the blackface minstrel show. Minstrel shows got started in around the 1830s, and they went on to pretty much dominate American entertainment for most of the rest of the century. Their most immediately obvious characteristic was the fact that performers, who were initially exclusively white and male, used burnt cork to blacken their faces in an overtly racist mimicry of African American skin tone. They also typically shared a rigid 3-act structure and a set of stock characters, kind of like the ones you might see in the Italian commedia dell'arte tradition, except that these characters were invariably employed to perpetuate harmful stereotypes about the intelligence and trustworthiness of African Americans. Without going into too much detail, the tropes of minstrelsy were pretty much based around an idea of slavery as a kind of natural and beneficial situation for black people in America. And its major preoccupations included the supposed incompatibility of black people with the northern urban world, and nostalgia for a fictionalized and idealized version of the lives of enslaved people in the pre-Civil War South. By the time we're talking about, the popularity of minstrel shows was already in decline, but not really because of how horrendously racist they were. Of course, there were a lot of people who were aware of that and who campaigned against minstrelsy for pretty much the same reasons that we would today. But what really killed it was just kind of that it started to seem old-fashioned, as more forms of entertainment became available, and as the stereotypes it perpetuated just gradually stopped being the ones people cared about. Just because it became less popular doesn't mean that it stopped mattering, though. In fact, the legacy of minstrelsy is something that's been pretty much unavoidable ever since. Minstrel shows themselves actually survived for a very long time, pretty much as a marker of old-fashionedness. Many of us grew up, perhaps unaware that we were watching countless references to it in cartoons, and it was actually possible, in many parts of the US, to go see a literal minstrel show, usually put on by a school or community organization, until well into the 1960s. On top of that, you have aspects of minstrelsy that seeped into vaudeville and other areas, and just never went away. These include the basic templates for both stand-up and sketch comedy, and at least a big part of the basis of the American popular song tradition, most especially in the songs of the 19th century's most famous American songwriter, Stephen Foster, who wrote most of his famous songs for a group called Christie's Minstrels in the 1840s and 50s. Variety shows around the turn of the century were packed full of ethnic mimicry, largely targeting relatively recent immigrant groups like Irish, Italian, Chinese, and Jewish Americans. So it's not so surprising that another aspect of minstrelsy that crossed over was the use of blackface, which remained pretty common in onstage performance for much of the century, and even played a pretty significant role in the early days of television. The continued use of blackface is a pretty unambiguous signal of the perpetuation of all of the racist and dehumanizing ideas that it represents, but individual performers might have found more laudable ways to use it here and there, like as a cover for black and white performers to appear on stage together, or as a kind of buffer to allow black performers to express ideas that might otherwise have put them in literal danger. That brings us to another area that might be a little bit more interesting for our exploration of music history, because one thing that happened as minstrelsy moved away from the center of the entertainment business is that it also became a little bit more accessible to black performers. By the end of the 19th century, there were several exclusively African-American minstrel troupes touring around the United States. As you might expect, these groups faced considerably greater challenges than their white counterparts. Typically, they were completely refused service in the towns they visited, so they had to be ready to provide everything they needed for themselves. At least one of these groups even felt the need to install secret escape chambers in their tour bus in case locals decided to just come and start shooting guns at them. These groups were also important because they provided the first viable opening for African Americans to enter the mainstream of the entertainment business. This was an incredibly narrow opening, and it was extremely difficult to get through, but it was more than had existed before. Two of the first performers to get through, and actually become among the biggest stars of the aughts, were the team of Burt Williams and George Walker. Williams and Walker first started to perform together in about 1893 in a group called Martin and Zelig's Mastodon Minstrels. They quickly made a name for themselves with comedy routines that conformed to the basic structures of minstrelsy, but also kind of turned them on their head by taking Williams' Rubish character, who would traditionally have been the butt of the joke, and giving him a kind of secret intelligence that inevitably resulted in him having the last laugh. In general, they preferred to punch up rather than down, and they worked hard to avoid the kind of harmful stereotypes that were typical in white minstrelsy, like razor fighting and chicken theft. They also strove to provide gainful employment to as many black performers, writers, and other theater professionals as they could. This turned out to be a pretty successful formula. When their first recordings came out in 1902, the Victor Records catalog boasted that they had been paid more to record than anyone else before them. The next year, they starred together in Dahomey, the very first full-length Broadway musical to have been written and performed entirely by African Americans. a satire on African colonialism featuring songs by Will Marion Cook, a musician who had studied under Antonin Dvorak and who had already been responsible for the very first all-African-American one-act Broadway musical a few years earlier. In Dahomey turned out to be a big success, even receiving a command performance at Buckingham Palace. The duo went on to star in 2 more successful musicals together before George Walker unfortunately passed away in 1911 at the age of 38. Burt Williams, who fellow comedian W.C. Fields called the funniest man I ever saw and the saddest man I ever knew, went on to even greater fame as the first African-American star of the Ziegfeld Follies, the era's preeminent Broadway revue. When he first joined the Follies, some of his fellow performers apparently attempted a power play, saying that they would leave the company if he was in it. Producer Florence Ziegfeld reportedly called their bluff, saying, "All of you are replaceable. Burt Williams isn't." Unfortunately, Ziegfeld's pragmatically progressive attitude was not typical of the white theatrical community. At this time, there were organizations like the White Rats, whose primary purpose was to set up barriers against both African Americans and women entering the theater. Their influence ensured that however successful Williams became, he would always be an exception and an outsider, and that must have been a tremendous burden for him to bear alone. In one telling anecdote, in 1919, the newly formed Actors' Equity Union decided to go on strike, and Williams was the only person to show up at work as usual the next day, because no one had even bothered to tell him. As he apparently told Fields, "I don't belong to either side. Nobody wants me." Williams passed away 3 years later in 1922, but he left a substantial legacy, and he may well have been the single greatest influence on the direction of comedy in the 20th century. In addition to subverting comedic tropes to make them actually funny instead of just mean, black minstrelsy also brought a much more accurate picture of African American music culture than had been available on stage before this point. This began in the 1870s when some groups started to feature spirituals, which added an air of authenticity despite being seemingly a bit out of place in the context. This was followed by a type of jigs and reels that we tend to associate with the beginnings of white country music, because by the time they started to be recorded in the 1920s, they were already regarded as too old-fashioned to be interesting by much of the black community. By the era we're talking about, though, the name of the game was ragtime. The term ragtime can refer to several different things. Today, it's probably most well known as what's basically a type of instrumental classical music that was first characterized by the composer Scott Joplin and then by many, many imitators since. On the playlist, I've included a performance of one of Joplin's rags, as well as one by the British composer Percy Grainger, written on themes from Williams and Walker's In Dahomey. It can also be a type of popular song, or, what the name really seems to imply, just a rhythmic concept that can be applied to any music. It's this rhythmic concept, a heavily syncopated melody over a rigidly straight bass line, that ties all the different notions of ragtime together. Although, of course, you can find plenty of music that uses the word ragtime that doesn't really have any syncopation to speak of at all. That aside, ragtime is probably the first thing we can point to that really functions like a modern popular music genre. In other words, it's the first time when the style started to pull ahead of the song in importance. For many people in the aughts, this style was evocative of a lifestyle that was young, modern, urban, and above all, exciting. It set the template for a string of overlapping, originally African American musical genres that have evoked that same mystique for subsequent generations, really ever since. The first two of these, blues and jazz, both developed directly under the umbrella of ragtime, and probably wouldn't really have been distinguishable from it in their original form. Neither of them started to be recorded until later on, but it's clear that both were having their early developments during the aughts. In New Orleans, Buddy Bolden's band, which was cited as a major formative influence by many early jazz innovators, was active during this era. Also, Ma Rainey, the most uncompromising of the classic blues queens, started touring with a minstrel troupe called the Rabbit's Foot Company in 1906, nearly 20 years before she made her first recordings. By the time both genres started to be heavily recorded in the 1920s, tastes had moved on. But you can find examples in both of artists who played in a more antiquated style, perhaps to appeal to an older audience, where the ragtime feel is still unmistakably there. A good example in blues would be Blind Blake, and in jazz, Jelly Roll Morton. Interestingly, in country music, which, as I mentioned, was an inherently backwards-looking genre that was still rooted in pre-ragtime African-American styles in the 1920s, this ragtime vibe comes in much later, and you can really start to notice it in artists like Chet Atkins and Doc Watson in the 50s and 60s. Okay, I have to end it somewhere, so I'm ending it here. I hope you've enjoyed what I've had to say about the aughts, and maybe even learned something. Come back soon for the next chapter about the teens, the decade about which I have the least to say. But then I didn't really think I had much to say about the aughts either, so we'll see what happens. One final thing before I go. For each decade, I just want to include a little special treat without much commentary. Just something that I came across in my research that surprised and delighted me, and that I hope will surprise and delight you as well. For the aughts, I've chosen the rival ragtime banjo virtuosos Wes Osman and Fred Van Epps. I've included a song by each in the playlist, so enjoy that. I'll have something up next week, so look for that. And in the meantime, stay healthy and happy, and don't forget to listen to some music now and then.